Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal of Being in Love by Is This Self-Care? Narrated by S.E.P. Chapter 27, Theo's Party. Author notes: it wouldn't be a proper rom-com without an accidental kiss. Right, we have finally got to Theo's party. I've been waiting to share this chapter for a long time, so please enjoy. Do forgive my Beauty and the Beast moments. I am weak. So, the quashing. It was objectively not going well. As Draco preferred to fault anyone but himself for his problems, he laid the blame squarely upon Granger, who had no business smiling at him. Frankly, how dare she? Obnoxious behavior, thoughtless, rude, really. Granger carried on in a cheerful ignorance of her culpability. As the days went by, she settled into life at the manor with surprising ease, perhaps because she was rarely actually there. She arrived in time to inhale a late dinner, most nights, and was awake early again the next day, dragging a bleary-eyed Draco behind her as she frolicked off to save the world. Potter and Weasley visited Granger often. The three of them shared long late-night conversations, piled upon each other in some salon or other. Draco joined only when specifically invited in by Granger. He spent enough time with those two duffers at the office that he didn't relish more of their company. He also found them rather too watchful. Potter in particular. Not that there was anything to see here. Even in his wildest lapses into truth, Draco would never admit how much he enjoyed Granger's admittedly sporadic company at the manor. The way her presence filled the great rooms with warmth. The pleasure of dinner time repartee. Walking through a corridor and knowing that she'd just passed there because of the lingering smell of soap. Even her cat was a decent addition to the house. Late one night, a "mrar" at the foot of Draco's bed informed him that the creature had somehow entered his rooms and was calling plaintively for him. Then it had looked at him in a self-pitying kind of way that Draco realized that it was lost. He had walked it back to Granger's suite, knocked, and told her, "I believe this is yours," as the cat bounded into familiar territory. Granger had been doing yoga, and was wearing those clothes, and was sweaty, and breathless, and shining, and smelled like salt and candle smoke. She had gasped, "Oh, Krunks, my darling, you shouldn't go too far," and a trickle of perspiration had run down between her breasts, which Draco did not look at. Anyway, the cat was all right. Draco never explicitly admitted to himself, but behind the quashing, in a secret, stupid, soppy part of his soul, he wished that they could share more quiet moments together, uninterrupted by screams of pain at the A&E or swatty graduate students at her laboratory. Or perhaps it was better this way. Perhaps anything else would be too much. He had often wondered what pushed so many of his friends to marriage in the smallness of domesticated bliss. But sometimes, when Granger came home and smiled a hello and sat next to him at the table, sometimes for a brief moment he understood. Those moments were a glimpse of something he didn't know he wanted. But they were fleeting, and the fleeting vanished, and she went to bed, and left him with a sense of loss and something that he had never had in the first place. He had one such moment on a rainy October day. It was a Sunday, and miracle of miracles, both he and Granger were off. By the time Draco made it to the dining room, Granger was having lunch, but she kindly called it brunch as she waved him to a chair. Draco asked for porridge, unfermented, from the kitchens. Granger sat cross-legged in her chair, one hand occupied with her fork, the other with a foldy computer surrounded by silver pucks. Draco had just settled in to enjoy the quiet and the company when the moment was interrupted by Theo's owl, who dropped two identical envelopes over the table, one in Granger's lap, one directly into Draco's porridge. Granger opened hers to discover an invitation from Theo. She showed it to Draco, who saw that Theo had taken great pains with it. The script was beautiful, the parchment was of the highest grade, the ink shimmered luxuriously. "Dear Healer Professor Dr. Granger, I understand that you are to be thanked, blamed, for our dear Draco's continued presence on this earth. A few friends of Draco's and I would relish the opportunity to celebrate your medical tour de force in person. I know it may come as a surprise, but he does have some friends. That being said, it will necessarily be an intimate gathering, as he has only 6. If you would be amenable to joining us, we would request the pleasure of your company at Knott House this Saturday at 7 o'clock. In the bottom corner of the invitation was a note. Dress, black tie. Draco's soggy envelope enclosed a note that made for rather a sharp contrast, scrawled in Theo's usual ineligible handwriting and written in biro. "Dear Fucko, lost my jotter, hence missive through ancient means. Drinks and delights at mine this Saturday at 7. I invited Granger. Come or I will kill you. Kisses, Theo. P.S. Invitation list enclosed for your edification." A crumpled napkin had been shoved into the envelope with the following information: Granger, Pansy and Longbottom, Blaze, Davies and wife, Luella, crossed out, abroad, Flint. Draco, I suppose. Draco tossed the note and napkin to Granger, who read Theo's illegible missive with her eyebrows raised. Goodness, we'd almost have to send this to Bletchley Park to have it deciphered. Does your correspondence with your friends typically involve death threats? Yes, and we attempt murders once or twice a year. It's a kind of tradition. Granger nodded as though this was entirely unsurprising and turned to examine the guest list. Any dodgy histories here? Only the last one. Oh, all about him. What about secret werewolves? Any of those? I bloody well hope not. I'd go first and have a poke about their heads if you decided to go. You'd let me go? Asked Granger. I'm not your gaoler, said Draco. Knott House is quite as well protected as the manor, and I'd be with you the entire time. And also, Theo had promised dancing and snuggling. And there it was, a textbook example of why some things between Aurors and principals were prohibited. His entire security analysis had been predicated on the potential for fucking snuggling. Draco opened his mouth to say that, on second thoughts, Granger probably oughtn't go. But Granger was now tapping at her lip. Black tie. I'll have to think about a dress. Draco closed his mouth. Draco and Granger arrived to flew to Knott House separately, to keep up the pretense that they were each in their own homes. Draco was to go first to scope the place out and confirm that there were no rogue werewolves on the premises. This ended up being a good idea, as Henriette got wind of the party and cloistered herself with Granger all afternoon and into the evening. By the time Draco was ready to leave, neither the witch nor the elf had emerged from the guest suite. There was only Toopy to see Draco off in all of his black tie resplendence. Draco flew to Knott House at 7:30. As he shook off the soot, Theo appeared to greet his esteemed guest. Thank you for coming, Draco. I know it's not something that you've been doing very much of. Draco and Theo entered the salon, where the small group of guests was already deep in conversation. Draco did a spot of unobtrusive legitimacy as he greeted them. No one had any naughty intentions, except for Longbottom and Pansy, who intended to find a secluded bathroom for a quick shag. Gods, muttered Draco instead of hello. Sorry? Said Longbottom. Pansy raised an eyebrow. Nothing. How are you? After brief small talk, Draco moved to Davies and his wife, Audrielle. Davies was thinking about where to hide his newest broom from his wife. His wife was missing the baby they had left all of 20 minutes ago, and wondered how early they could politely escape to home. Zabini, in an excellent fettle, had his mind upon a brainy brunette. However, before Draco could disembowel the man where he sat, he noticed Zabini's +1, Padma Patil, radiant in a turquoise gown. Zabini gave Draco one of his insufferable smirks. Patil's surface-level thoughts were of Zabini, mostly that he was a bit twattish, but she would endure him because he was also funny and a decent in bed. You're too good for Zabini, said Draco to Patil. Oh, I know, said Patil with a wide smile. Zabini laughed. Flint was at the bar. His thoughts were bent on cajoling the house elves into bringing out Theo's most prized bottles. That completed Draco's survey of the guests. He was satisfied that Granger could join the gathering safely and sent her a jot to that effect. Granger's answer came a moment later. They're in 10. Henriette is a bully. Draco began to find himself buzzing with anticipation, half nervous. Why? Half pleasant. Flint waved Draco towards him. What are you drinking? A G&T. Make it stiff. The house elf behind the bar squeaked. Yes, sir. Give him Theo's best stuff, said Flint, clapping Draco on the shoulder. We are celebrating Draco's survival tonight. Theo strode over and attempted to elbow Flint out of the way, with limited success. Pipsy, do not let this man berate, persuade, or otherwise impel you to open that vault. Of course not, sir, said the elf with a distrustful look at Flint. He took abominable liberties with my collection last time, said Theo to Draco. Horrible man. Flint, unabashed, took his drink and blew Theo a kiss before joining Davies. Pipsy, the house elf, presented Draco with his G&T, very stiff. He approved. Any idea when we might expect your guardian angel? Asked Theo, glancing towards the alcove outside the salon, where the flue hearth flickered. She did say she was coming. Haven't a clue, shrugged Draco. They joined the others at the sofas. Draco kept up a passable stream of conversation, and his attention kept drifting to the flue. He was nervous. Why was he nervous? Finally, the flames turned green, and Granger's form spun into existence within, and she was deposited upon the hearth stones. Ah, said Theo, who had apparently been watching the fire with equal attention. Our guest of honor. He leapt to his feet to usher Granger into the salon. She was besieged by Longbottom, hugs, Padma, more hugs, Pansy, cheek kiss, and Zabini, firm handshake. Draco, being the cool and self-possessed sort, whose heart rate had certainly not accelerated, merely raised his glass to her from the sofa. She gave him a small smile. Draco turned his gaze back to Flint, without hearing anything that the man was saying, because, oh no, Granger was wearing a black gown, and it was low in the back, and there was a slit in it up her thigh, and her hair was swept to the side, showing off that part of her neck that looked the most delicious, and Flint had just asked him a question, and he had no idea what was going on. She had a rose in her hair. "What?" said Draco. "Sorry, I couldn't hear you over the sound of the ice in my glass." "Bollocks," said Flint with a smirk. He inclined his head towards Granger. "You're distracted." Draco flicked a V at him and sipped his drink. "Don't get shirty with me," said Flint. "I'm not the one who went all daft and dewy-eyed in the middle of a conversation." "Me? Dewy-eyed? Absolute rot. I'm just preoccupied." "Give your head a wobble and give her a proper hello then, Mr. Preoccupied." "Fuck off." Draco rose and strode to the bar. "I need a refill." After opening greetings and chit-chat, Granger, Longbottom, and Patil formed a small group and got to talking about plants. A thrill. Pansy perched herself upon the arm of Longbottom's chair and looked on with an affectionate sort of ennui, twirling her fingers through her husband's hair. Draco wanted someone to twirl his hair, but her hands were occupied with a spirited description of some sort of fungus. He listened with one ear as Davies asked his immediate audience if they had seen the cannons get battered by the Puddlemere on Thursday. "No Quidditch talk," called Pansy across the room. "It stifles me." Granger looked amused. "You can just keep fingering your husband," retorted Flint with a brusque wave. "We'll keep it to a whisper." Always the height of class was Flint. Pansy smirked and began a more vigorous massage of Longbottom's head, who, for his part, had gone rather red. Pipsy the house elf served hors d'oeuvres and refilled everyone's drinks. Flint and Sabini got to arm wrestling over something. Flint won. Davies shared a few ministry scandals, including a new one about what really went on in the love room at the Department of Mysteries. Theo flirted outrageously with anyone unmarried, including Granger, Patil, Flint, and Zabini. He had long ago determined that Draco was a lost cause, but nevertheless made the occasional sporting overture. When there was a lull in the conversation, Theo rose and tapped his glass. "I would like to propose a toast," he said, catching Draco's eye with a naughty grin. There was a stir as everyone rose, variously gathered up their skirts and drinks, and came to stand around Theo and Draco in a circle. Granger was nudged forwards by Longbottom on one side and Patil on the other. Incidentally, Longbottom's hair was now a disaster, and Draco almost reconsidered his wishes for the twirl of feminine fingers. "As you know," said Theo, looking solemn, "our Draco is afflicted by a chronic form of stupidity." There were grave mutters of tragic, heartbreaking, and poor wretch. "A chronic form of stupidity for which there is no known cure. His most recent lapse involved a spot of mano-a-mano combat with a Nundu, followed by a casual jaunt straight into a jet of its venom." Everyone shook their heads at the poignant tale. Draco contemplated Theo's murder. "Enter Hermione Granger," said Theo, holding his glass towards the witch in question, who looked a pretty combination of flustered and pleased. "Savior of idiots and champion of morons since, I believe, age 11. That's when you met Potter, right?" Thanks to her quick thinking and knowledge and, rather complicated muggle sciency things that I shan't attempt to explain, not because I don't understand them, but because you lot won't. Draco is still with us, free to continue being recklessly stupid for the remainder of his life. However short, not too short, we hope. And so I propose a toast to the triumph of modern medicine, to old enemies and new friends, to Draco Malfoy for being alive, and to Hermione Granger for saving his life. There was a resounding laugh-filled cheers. Draco found himself being jostled and slapped on the shoulder and punched in the ribs, and some oaf from the deepest circles of Cretanhood mussed his hair. Meanwhile, Granger was surrounded by a delicate crowd of people gently tapping their glasses to hers. "And when you've discovered a cure for stupidity, do let us know," said Pansy. "I will," grinned Granger. "Tell us, what do you think of Draco, now that you've got to know him a bit?" asked Theo. "Was he a good patient?" "He does grow on you," said Granger with a latent kind of affection, as though Draco was some sort of parasite that had taken up residence on her person and begun to endear itself to her. "Show us the scar, mate," said Flint. Draco, hero that he was, condescended to do so. He undid his bow tie and opened his collar, and there was a gratifying chorus of "ooh" at the sight. "Could the good professor explain what we're looking at?" asked Zabini, observing Draco's neck. Granger, who had been half watching over her shoulder, straightened and got professory. She stood next to Draco, her heels put her face at a very interesting distance to his, by the way, and began. Of course. This is developing into a lovely example of scar contracture. You see here along the sides the pulling together of the tissues. That's a typical presentation. The edges of the wound contract around the damaged skin, and it draws nearby tissue inwards. Malfoy is lucky. This one is small and won't affect his mobility. Bigger ones come with those sorts of challenges. The rest was lost on Draco, who was presently enjoying some interstellar travel because Granger's fingers kept brushing at his neck. Theo shook his head at Draco. You absolute maniac. You're lucky to be alive, much less pouncing about, drinking all of my best booze. Longbottom queried Granger on the characteristics of the venom, Patil on the treatment, Zabini on where one might obtain undue venom for purposes that he couldn't disclose. Granger's lecture ended, and there was a general mingling and drink refilling and eating. Draco did not bother to do his necktie up. An untied bow tie, a scar, and an open collar gave one a devil-may-care sort of look that he thought quite suited him. A gathering was beginning to form at the far end of the salon. Draco sauntered over, scotch in hand. Flint had either bullied or seduced Theo into opening a bottle, to see what the fuss was about. There was an ornate gilded frame on the wall, and within the frame, the splatter of wine from Draco's frothy wing fest a month ago. Theo had added a small inscription beside the frame. The turbulence of the soul. 21st century. Mixed media. Artist unknown. Theo looked upon it fondly. Do you like it? There's an elegance to it, said Patil, tilting her head to the side. Very modern, said Pansy. I therefore don't understand it. What do you make of it, Hermione? Asked Theo. Granger considered the oeuvre. It's very, expressionist. Kandinsky, but drunk, proposed Patil. Can you feel the restrained passion? Theo gripped at his breast. The confusion, the frustration. There's something I like about it, said Granger. A kind of botheration. A kind of self-denial, I think, said Theo, his fingers on his chin. And you, Draco? Thoughts on my newest acquisition? Draco glared at Theo, the cheekiest twat who had ever twatted. I didn't realize that you were such a patron of the arts. I like to encourage genius when I see it. So many of these young artists don't know their own potential. Theo amused himself for a few more minutes, probing the ladies of their interpretations of the work and their opinions on the artist's choice of materials. He was given to understand that the paint had been rather expensive and aged 30 years before application. An irritated Draco retreated to the safety of Davies, Flint, and Quidditch. What's got you looking like someone shit in your kettle? Asked Flint. Help me with this, said Draco, passing him a bottle. Gladly. With Flint and Davies' assistance, Draco emptied Theo's cherished bottle in revenge. When Theo had exhausted his fount of amusement with the ladies, he called the room at large. Shall we dance? There was clapping and a chorus of yeses. Wands were raised to clear a space, and music filled the room, and Zabini charmed the chandelier above them to spin as Theo dimmed the lights. The dance did not go as planned in Draco's head. To begin with, by some twist of fate, or unspoken mutual agreement he didn't know, he and Granger danced with everyone except each other. Patil, Adriel, and Pansy each took a spin with Draco. Meanwhile, seeing Granger in Flint's arms made Draco wish to garrote the man with his own bow tie. Seeing her in Zabini's clutches invited thoughts of suffocation with one of the sofa cushions. And Theo, Draco had half a mind to smash his glass into a shiv and stab him. Longbottom was fine, however. There was spinning, there was dipping, there was some ill-advised lifting of ladies by half-drunk men, and once of a man, Theo, by a very drunk woman, Pansy. There was laughter. Then Theo, who seemed far more sober than he was letting on, drew attention to the fact that Draco hadn't even had a proper dance with his savior, which was unacceptable. To Draco's annoyance, he and Granger were pushed together, and everyone gathered about and danced with them around them. And it was not at all the intimate vision that Draco had daydreamed about to excess. He and Granger held each other stiffly. Granger looked annoyed under her smile. He trod on her foot, and she trod on his. They snarled at each other. Draco said that her feet were so small that if he was treading on them, it must be because she was wedging hers under his on purpose. Granger said that if she was treading on his, it was because one couldn't help stepping on Draco's feet, if one was in the same room as him, given their surface area. And why isn't your tie done up? Asked Granger in a techie whisper. Because you were using me as a specimen for your demonstration, muttered Draco. Fix it. Draco took this insinuation that Granger did not approve of his devil-may-care suave look as a personal affront. You fix it, said Draco, equally techy. I don't know how to tie bow ties. I'll show you when we've been released from this tyranny. Perhaps you can learn something for once. Me? Learn something? For once? The remainder of their dance went on just as harmoniously. After 2 or 3 songs, they were freed from the circle and able to stand a little apart from the group and sip drinks and pretend not to be aggravated by, well, everything. Granger bit a samosa, as she thought as it personally wronged her. Draco had a spirited battle with a cocktail shrimp. Right, said Draco, reaching for his tie. Since you care so much. Granger observed him as he demonstrated the knot, with a sort of annoyed focus. Have you got it? Asked Draco. Yes. Draco pulled it undone again. Show me. Granger spoted into her glass. What? You didn't tell me there was going to be a test? Marked out of 10. A test? A specific disaster named Theo popped into being next to Draco. Ooh, let's see how you do, Hermione. But I wasn't watching. I was watching, but not... Anyway, all right, I'll have a go. Granger tottered closer and made an attempt. Draco couldn't even enjoy a bit of it because 2 more idiots came by in the form of Zabini and Longbottom. What's going on over here? Asked Zabini. She's tying the knot, said Theo. With who? Draco. Ooh. What's happening? Asked Pansy. They're tying the knot, said Zabini. Patil arrived. What are we doing? Draco and Hermione are tying the knot, said Theo. I'm tying a knot, said Granger. Patil looked confused. A knot? A bow tie, said Granger with great patience. That kind of a knot, not knot. Flint arrived. Who's tying the knot? Hermione is, with Draco. I am not, said Granger. No, I'm not, said Theo. Draco informed them all that he hated them. Granger stepped back and looked cynically at her handiwork. I'm not quite certain that's a pass. Draco examined the bow tie in a nearby mirror. 6 out of 10. How can you be so cruel to Hermione? Asked Theo. She tried so. Granger made a substantial positive contribution to Draco's mood by saying, I suppose I'll have to practice more on him. Draco knotted his bow tie to his usual standard and made a note to ensure that Granger was provided with opportunities for self-improvement. There was a migration from the dance floor to the bar for more drinks. Everyone grew pleasantly sloshed on their tipple of choice. The expensive scotch in Draco's veins made him relaxed and languorous. Pansy and Longbottom disappeared for a longish time and returned looking only slightly disheveled. Davies and wife made their exit through the flue. At the bar, Theo began to mess about with cocktails. He was swirling his wand over a bowl of something white and frothy. Right, which of you wants to try my newest creation? Pipsy, the house elf, set out crystal champagne flutes, looking excited. She poured a generous measure of rosé champagne into every one. What kind of cocktail? Asked Pansy, observing the proceedings. I call it champagne de amore, said Theo. There's nothing Italian about it. I just thought it sounded sexy. Pansy propped her elbows onto the bar to watch and was joined there by Patil. Granger looked a combination of curious and cynical and kept her distance. Theo pulled out a small vial and held it up. The secret ingredient. Let's see how well you lot remember your potions. He poured the vial into the bowl of white mousse. Steam sizzled upwards to graceful spirals. That's amortentia, gasped Patil. Messing about with controlled substances, are we? Asked Draco. You're a cheeky little thing, said Flint. Amortentia gives it a certain... Theo's mouth squeezed into the pucker of a Brit about to speak French. Je ne sais quoi. Well, below the threshold for an actual dose of amortentia, of course. Just enough to taste positively delicious. We're microdosing on amortentia? Asked Granger with a raised eyebrow. Only if you'd like to, said Theo. He added a dollop of the white foam to each champagne flute. Don't worry, Doctor. In these minute concentrations, you won't fall in love with me. It's merely a flavor enhancer. Foolish of you to assume we aren't already in love with you, said Zabini. Theo blew him a kiss. The row of champagne flutes sparkled pink and white. Theo, his tongue poking out between his teeth as he concentrated, added a curl of some kind of citrus garnish. Voila! Ooh, said Pansy, taking hers and passing the other to Longbottom. Zabini wiggled his eyebrows, and he and Patil took theirs. They touched glasses. Flint downed his in a single swallow. Let's have another. They're meant to be savored, you great lout, said Theo. What? Are we rationing champagne? Asked Flint. Why are we rationing champagne? Gasped Pansy. Is there a war? Flint leaned over the bar and said in a loud whisper, Make me another, and I'll tell you what mine tasted like. Theo grew flustered. Pipsy passed out the remaining flutes of champagne. Draco's Scotch-induced languor gave way to apprehension mingled with a paralyzing fatalism. Apprehension for what was to come, fatalism because he knew, deep down in his quashed heart of hearts, what was to come. Pipsy gave Draco his flute of champagne de amore. He stepped away from the bar and concealed himself behind the convenient landmass that was Flint. He stared at the gently bubbling concoction. Ridiculously, his heart was racing. He did not need to smell it to discover what was going to greet him. The fatalism grew heavy. The inevitability of it was a slow horror. He held the delicate flute to his face, feeling the fizz of champagne on the tip of his nose. He took a breath, and there it was. Coffee, brine-filled air, antiseptic. And now there were more complex undercurrents of it, too. Shampoo, adventure dust, saturines, the smell of a candle just burnt. Granger in a glass. Fuck. Draco cleared his throat and glanced about, and tried to look unconcerned. Granger was now stepping forwards to take hers from the house elf. On her face was a look of noble dread, as of a queen walking to the guillotine. After taking the flute, she held it at waist height, well away from her face, and turned to chat with Patil. Patil was distracted by a squabble between Flint and Theo. Granger visibly steeled herself. Draco watched as she lifted the glass to her face. She breathed in and looked stricken, as though some ghastly thing had just been confirmed. She hardly had time to collect herself when Pansy turned to her. Have you tried yours? Granger, tight about the jaw, gave Pansy a restricted sort of smile and took a sip. And? Asked Theo. Delicious, said Granger in a strangled voice. When the group's focus had moved elsewhere, Granger stared at the flute, as though she were pondering spilling its contents onto the floor. She did not look at Draco. Longbottom held his champagne under his nose and sighed. My wife after a shower. Zabini sniffed his. I'm getting, ginger. Emotional stability, said Patil, inhaling hers with a last. And bergamot. Damp grass, said Pansy. A fire in late winter, mused Theo. Leather, said Flint. Ooh, said everyone. Sloe gin, said Granger. She was lying. Fresh-picked lavender. Mint. And crushed basil. Orange peel, lied Draco. Masala chai. Nougat. Theo topped them off with a little more champagne, and the crowd dispersed. The ladies lingered at the bar. Pipsy snapped her fingers and stared at the fire in the salon's fireplace, which the men gathered around. They pulled a few chairs in close for some cozy philosophizing. Draco threw himself upon a chair in an attitude suggestive of careless elegance and manly athleticism, in case Granger looked his way. They talked of travel. Draco sipped his drink. Draco was doing it right, said Theo with an approving look. Doing what right? Asked Draco. Savoring. It was true, he was. The champagne was bliss in a glass. The amitentia was so lightly dosed that it felt like memories on his tongue, rather than tastes. It lured feelings out from behind the quashing and made him want to revel in them. There was a leisurely sort of misery accompanying the bliss. It made him aware that he wanted things. Not just obvious Granger things, but deeper things. The conversation moved back to travel plans, and Draco was left to savor. He looked at Longbottom and found himself, for the first time in his life, envious of the man. He wanted what this plonker had. He wanted to be wanted, not for his name or for his money or his looks, but for being a decent, occasionally stupid man. He wanted someone to twirl his hair and do his bow ties. He wanted someone to grasp his hand and pull him onto dance floors and into bathrooms for quickies, and along the path of life. It was a yearning, as delicious as it was painful. He occluded before he could fall too far into besotted, self-pitying despair. He didn't need the Carthusians and their devious torments, armed with a glass of amortentia champagne. He could amply torture himself. Talk now turned to Theo's plans for a vineyard. Draco hasn't given us his usual grain of salt, said Zabini. I think it's going to be an utter failure. Draco is preoccupied tonight, said Flint. I'm savoring, said Draco. Let him savor, said Theo, flinging a protective arm across Draco's chest. Ideal locations for Theo's vineyard were batted about. Some favored France, some Italy, some argued for exotic locales like distant California. Draco released his barrier of occlusion as his emotional turbulence subsided. The three witches wandered towards the fire in a tidily manner, arms hooked into one another. Patil was passing a finger through Granger's curls. May I form a parasocial relationship with your hair? It got so long. Only if I can with yours, said Granger, looping Patil's plait around her palm. I positively love it. Ladies, join us, said Zabini. Shh, said Flint, leaning forward with interest. Don't interrupt. I want to see where this goes. But it was too late. Granger and Fatil disentangled themselves from one another, and where it was going would remain a tragic mystery. Pansy observed the gathering wizards and crossed arms and cocked hip. Join you? You've pulled up precisely enough chairs for your 5 shapely arses. I'll conjure, began Longbottom. No, said Theo. He gestured toward the laps of the various gentlemen around the fire. There's loads of space. Pansy, smirking, strode towards Longbottom with an exaggerated sway in her hips, and collapsed onto him with an ease that spoke of years of familiarity. The small, joyous barb prickled at Draco's heart. Patel slipped onto Zabini's knee. And Granger? Granger was going for her wand, and a moment away from conjuring a chair, when Theo called her courage into question by saying, You mustn't be afraid of Draco, you know. He is quite domesticated. I'm sure he won't bite. The look that Granger leveled at Theo was combative in nature. Afraid? Of him? And then, drunk and bursting with bravado, she strode towards Draco, dropped herself onto his lap, and made him hold her champagne flute, while she arranged her skirts. Granger was in his lap. Granger was in his lap. Draco wanted to die. Also, he resolved to kill Theo for the 3rd time that evening. He would ask Zabini for Nundu venom when he acquired it. Granger had seated herself across his legs, her bum on his thighs, her feet crossed at the ankles off to the side. This offered Draco an excellent view of her profile, including the side of her breast, clad in clingy black fabric, precisely at eye level. Draco averted his eyes to find something safer to look at. His gaze landed lower, where the slit of her dress exposed her thigh, right there, near his crotch. Unsafe. He looked at Longbottom's shoes instead. Granger was warm, hot even. Do you bite? Asked Granger. On request, said Draco with a slow smile. Nothing wrong with a bit of recreational flirting. His friends would think it odd if he didn't, really. It threw her. Draco filed this away as a new method of bothering Granger, though its exploration seemed fraught with danger for the botherer as well as the botheree. Granger plucked her drink out of Draco's hand. Theo, satisfied with the arrangements, turned away to continue to be a nuisance elsewhere. Does Theo know about your anesthesia-induced flights of fancy, or was this a coincidence? Asked Granger. Sheer coincidence. I can assure you I did not share those thoughts with the class. Dreams really do come true. In the most unexpected ways, said Draco, before retreating to safer territory. Was Henriette a terrible bully? Yes, very insistent on the black. She would be, the meddlesome little scamp. Draco could smell Granger's shampoo, but he didn't know if it was coming from her or the flutes of Amortentia champagne fizzled in their hands. This was fine. He was not going to get hard just because a woman was on his knee. He was an adult. Theo was now insulting Zabini's taste in wine. Patil joined in with glee. Apparently this had been a source of previous argument, and she had an arsenal of witticisms at the ready. Granger was studying Theo with a perilous sort of glint in her eye. Turn him into a cockroach, suggested Draco. I may. What's this about cocks? Asked Flint. Cockroaches, said Draco. Who is talking about cocks? Asked Pansy. Draco, said Flint. Typical, said Pansy. Granger is going to turn Theo into a cockroach, said Draco. You can do that? Asked Zabini. Obviously, said Granger. Theo raised his glass with a wary look at Granger. Cheers. Just what I wanted. A new phobia. Very Kafka-esque, said Patel. You'll have to write a book about your experience. These Philistines won't grasp that reference, sniffed Theo. Excuse me, I've got to go refill my drink and incidentally flee Hermione's vicinity. She can do it at range, called Draco to Theo's retreating back. He felt the shake of Granger's withheld laugh as Theo's strides accelerated away. The talk turned back to wine. Zabini mounted a fairly sound defense of Vermentino. Granger was on his lap. Draco tried not to think about it. He gave an opinion on tannins. He felt warm under the collar. He loosened his bow tie. From across the room, Theo shouted, Right! The practice! Which wasn't at all what Draco had been going for, but all right. Granger started. Oh, I think I've already forgotten everything. She drew closer to Draco with a tipsy sort of focus. She had done a smoky thing around her eyes that made them even more folly-inny. Draco therefore did not look at her. He admired the ceiling. He felt a slight tug here and there at his neck as Granger mucked about with his bow tie. Wait, muttered Granger. That's, no, wrong. Wait, ugh. Granger's fingers were careful around his scar as she undid whatever she had just done. Draco indulged in a brief daydream wherein she continued to undo things, starting with the rest of his buttons, and then him. His cock began to take an interest in the proceedings and twitched at him. Brilliant. Granger stared at the bow tie tangle and sighed. Bugger, I've got no idea where I am. Draco didn't either, so that was fine. Granger hiccuped, shuffled deeper into his lap, and started over. He waited for his brain to suggest a droll remark, but all it proposed was glurk. Draco was much obliged. If she shuffled closer and did much more wiggling, he would soon be providing Granger with the hard evidence she so craved. Distantly, he registered words of encouragement from Longbottom to Granger. Done, said Granger. Longbottom inspected it and said it was a proper bow tie this time. Granger conjured a mirror for Draco to give his judgment. All he really took in was his own reflection, dark-eyed, with a flush pink across the top of his cheekbones. Also, he had a hair out of place. 8 out of 10, said Draco. Hold that there for me, darling. I've got to fix this. Granger was not a darling. She gave him a look that was cutting. He fixed his hair just in time. She transformed the mirror into a concave monstrosity that made him look like the Scroot. Zabini sauntered off to find Theo, followed by Patil. I suppose I've improved, at least, said Granger, but it was clear that it was rankled in her swotty soul that she had not achieved top marks. It's rather fun to teach you something for a change. There's loads I'd like you to teach me. Oh? That magic detection spell, said Granger in a low voice. The one you used at my cottage. Draco said in an equally low voice. Only if you teach me that runic command, the one you used on the arrows. Granger thought about it, a finger on her lip. Then she came in closer, smelling delicious, and whispered, Fine, but you've got to teach me the geodesic warding spell in exchange. There was nothing titillating about geodesic warding spell, and yet Draco found himself clenching his jaw to suppress a shiver as the words ran across his ear and went straight to his groin. He was half-hard. Draco had one final request, so private that he gestured Granger to even closer. One of her curls brushed across his mouth as she leaned in. Then you've got to teach me the computer, said Draco. Granger gasped. You extortionist! I know. You'll have to produce a better bargaining chip. The computer's secrets are too powerful. Oh? I'll have to think about something else to offer. Granger ran a hand down her arm. She had goosebumps, which was wickedly satisfying, but also potentially a problem. These pedagogical matters having been negotiated and settled, each took a sip of their champagne. Draco glanced about and was pleased to discover that no one was paying any attention to them. Flint was explaining to Longbottom that he was banned from the Fortescues. Draco hadn't caught the rest of the tale, which might ordinarily have interested him, but these were not ordinary times. Pansy was dozing on Longbottom's shoulder. Flint muttered that he was desperate for a slash and rose. Longbottom carried Pansy to one of the sofas. Granger swirled the remainder of her champagne and watched the pink liquid fizz. Orange peel, she said, looking pensive. What about it? Asked Draco. What happened to your toffee and coffee? What happened to your expensive cologne? You were lying. So were you. Why? Why were you? I suppose it's quite private. Yes. Granger, swaying a little in Draco's lap, downed the rest of her champagne. She swallowed. A drop lingered on her lip, which she wiped away with the tip of her finger. Glurk. Draco looked away until it was safe, and then back again. Now her face was close to his. Her gaze was soft, tipsy, dreamy. I hate that this tastes so good, said Granger. She looked devastated by it, sexily devastated. She pressed her fingertip between her lips. Draco finished his own champagne to distract himself. Granger's gaze flitted to his mouth and back up again. I positively loathe mine. If that is any comfort, said Draco. Strangely it is. Draco shifted under the pretense of getting more comfortable, or something. Granger slid in closer as a result. He could feel the swell of her breast against his chest. The mass of her hair was trapped between them and tickled his neck. And there was the Granger gravitational force, the falling towards, the drawing in. Her mouth was 2 inches from his. Her eyes were warm. He could slip a hand behind her neck and, gods, from the way she was leaning, he wouldn't have to pull her in. She would just fall into him. And it would be... Granger blinked and breathed out and drew back. It would be a bad idea, yes. I have had too much to drink, and I am not thinking clearly, said Granger, and it sounded like she was declaring it to herself, rather than to Draco. I have never thought less clearly in my life, said Draco. Granger sat up straighter. The warmth in her eyes was extinguished. She was occluding. Draco followed suit. It was probably the right thing to do, rather than a full-on snog in the middle of Theo's party, anyway. They looked about to find that they were alone. All of the chairs were empty. Granger had been sitting on his lap under the weakest of pretenses, but now there was absolutely no reason for it. There were voices from the flue hearth just outside the salon. People were getting ready to leave. With a sudden, panicky vigor, Granger sprung off Draco's lap. She strode to the bar, where she asked Pipsy for an ice water, which was promptly downed. Then she dropped the glass onto the bar and stiff-backed, stared at nothing. Pipsy asked if everything was all right, miss. Granger, in a tight voice, said that yes, everything was fine. Draco waited for long enough to ensure the disposition of any hard evidence, and then walked to the group at the flue. The occlusion helped with the general air of insouciance he wished to convey as he joined in with the goodbyes. Granger joined them, looking relatively composed, and also gave her thanks and farewells. Longbottom, carrying Pansy, disapparated into the flue, followed by Zabini and Patil, then Flint. Draco lured Theo back to the salon under some pretext so that Granger could flee to the manor without being heard. You were less of a miserable bastard than usual tonight, said Theo. You're a meddlesome little twat, said Draco. Glad you had a good time. I hated every moment. Theo grinned. Fuck off home, Draco. Draco gave him a wave and strode to the flue. He hoped that Granger hadn't run off straight to bed during his chat with Theo. They had unfinished business. He was going to get his bloody dance. Draco stepped out of the flue to find Henriette assisting Granger with a delicate dusting off of her gown. Henriette cleaned Draco off too, then bid them both good night, an annoying sort of twinkle in her eye. Right, said Draco, straightening his bow tie. Good that you're still here. Granger looked guarded. Why? Draco took her arm and strode out of the flue parlor. Where are we? Gasped Granger. The ballroom. But what? I want a proper dance. But we? No, that was rubbish. Granger mounted no further objections, but allowed her drunken self to be pulled along, looking politely confused. Draco pushed open the ballroom's enormous double doors. The elves kept every room in the manor ready for use at a moment's notice, and the regal ballroom was no exception. In the penumbra, the white marble floor shone and the multitude of mirrors that covered the walls sparkled. At the south end, the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched upwards until they disappeared into shadow. Draco waved his wand at the vaulted ceilings. 8 enormous crystal chandeliers glowed into life, lowered, and began a slow rotation across the ceiling. Their lights reflected brilliantly off the glossy marble and the mirrors. Another wand wave and the sound of an orchestra resonated through the ballroom. Granger gasped in that delighted, breathy, lips-parted just so way of hers that gave Draco so much pleasure. He felt a grin make its way onto his face. It is quite splendid, isn't it? It is! Draco took one of Granger's hands in his, put the other on her waist, and began to lead her through a waltz before she could get Grangery and pose too many questions, such as whether he had gone mad. They danced a few cautious steps. He glanced at her to see whether she was planning on bolting from the lunatic, but she was following his lead, looking wary but curious. She had looked at him this way once before, when he had charmed an entire cohort of Muggle doctors at the Oxford pub. It was a pleasant surprise, and the "Who the bloody hell are you?" all in one. As it had been in Provence, her waist was warm under his palm. Her hand was gentle in his. She was light as they moved, and this time there was no treading on one another's feet. Draco watched their dance in the mirrors, how her figure nestled so snugly next to his, how her gown whisked in time with their movements, brushing at his legs when they turned. He indulged unrepentantly in his kaleidoscope of angles through which to delight her. If he looked ahead, it was the dip between her bare shoulder blades in the mirror there. To the left, it was the curve of her backside. If he looked down, it was the dark eyelashes, flushed cheeks, and pink lips. She came in closer as they turned and pressed against him, and it felt gorgeous. He didn't let her pull away again. His hand slipped to her lower back and kept her there. She looked up at him in dark wonder, then looked down, her lip between her teeth. The music swelled. Around them the ballroom spun, the stars in the windows glowed, the chandeliers danced their own soft twinkle dance and scattered splendor through the room. It was a moment of enchantment, of harmony, of gleaming reverie. Their eyes were filled with lights, and their ears were a crescendo of violins, and their hearts with each other. This is what he had wanted. He raised his arm, and she spun away from him, and they were joined only at the fingertips, and then she was twirled back into him so close that he felt her take her next breath. The light was in his veins again, the Mabon sun, incandescent, glorious, swelling about his heart and squeezing the very air out of him. Again she spun away, and this time came in with her back to him, pressed against his chest, her bum against his groin. Their eyes locked in one of the mirrors, and it was too intense to sustain, and they looked away again. Now it was his turn to partake in some ill-advised lifting, which he did, with his hands around her waist, sweeping her up into the air. He spun her while she was aloft, taking pleasure in her gasp, in her grip on his shoulders. She flew above him with a squeal of surprised laughter. When he brought her down, she clung to him, laughing, and the brightness of real joy in her eyes. He felt a matching joy whose like he had never felt before. The lightness in him was sublime. Her arms were around his neck. She was so close to him that he wanted to explode. The feeling was rare, precious, heart-rending. She was radiant. She took his breath away. She was everything he wanted. The lights dimmed, the music quieted. They stopped moving and stood in this lover's embrace, breathing, dark-eyed, high on one another, waiting. Granger, She looked up. He had nothing more. He was falling. He didn't need the ring to tell him that her heart was racing. He could feel the pulse of it against his chest. His thudded a matching beat, too fast, so fast it hurt. He was drunk on endorphins and too much good booze and too little good sense. Her lips were parted. She was looking at him like she could kiss him. It was impossible. It couldn't happen. Now her fingers were on his jaw. He bent towards her. The pull was too sweet. Her kiss was a soft question. His answer was to squeeze her up and into him. She gasped against his lips, and he kissed her back. Finally! Fucking finally! Their mouths met with the press of yearning. Too much champagne. Of, I hate that this tastes so good. Only now it wasn't amortentia that he tasted. It wasn't those fragrant, fabricated whiffs. It was her. It was real. And the champagne was a poor imitation. Now that he had the real thing against him. Breathing staccato breaths against his mouth. Winding fingers into his shirt. The amortentia didn't speak of the softness of her lips, of quivering, of fingers hooked into his collar, of a witch delicious, flush-cheeked, unsteady, pressing her smiling mouth into his. She shook slightly, as did he, with the euphoric mess of adrenaline and nerves and restraint. She pulled away and pressed her face into his neck. The intimacy of it sent his heart into a fresh frenzy. His arms wrapped around her. She was fine-boned and delicate and trembling deliciously. I'm still not thinking clearly, she said, her voice low and dusky, her words brushing across a scar. Shall we say it's the drink? Asked Draco in a half-whisper. Yes, breathed Granger with relief. Let's. We had a lot. And that's certainly to blame for any unwise behaviors. There was the golden sound of her laughter. Obviously. They looked at each other. He thought he could die happy if her lips wet his again. And then they did.